Hi, everybody. Let me just make sure that you have what I need here. Let's see. Make sure this is the slide you guys see. Yeah, there we go, I think. Okay, great. Well, hello. It's great to be here today, guys. My name is Steven Atkinson. I'm a geriatric provider that works in the Twin Cities area, the great state of Minnesota. All right, and it's wonderful to be with you today. I understand that we have about 600 attendees from various countries, and I'll try to be as inclusive as possible. Okay, but the breadth of that difference, different countries and different states, even amongst the states. There could be some information today that applies exclusively to the state that I live in, as well as the country I reside in, okay? Needless to say, I'm really excited to talk to everybody today about this topic. And the biggest reason for that is finally there's a treatment option for people who get COVID, okay? Or for those who are even exposed to COVID and have risk factors that, well, theoretically potentiate decline with disease, independent of their vaccination status, right? And for those of you who are wondering, this will also be recorded by PESI, and so there's a link that will be available, I'm sure, on their website at some point, so that this can be rewatched if you want to. And at the same time, for people who, I've had several attendees say, hey, will it be recorded? Yes, it will be. And for those of you who couldn't make it today, then you will be able to see it as well, okay? So again, my name is Steven Atkinson. My email address is right there. This lecture will go exactly an hour, and there will be no time for questions and answers, primarily because of the last time I did this, there were like 4,000 attendees, and there were probably 14 countries that were participating. And so consequently, the issue became trying to navigate all of that. So what PESI will do is they'll collect all of the questions and they'll send them to me, and then I'll select out the ones that I think are, well, at least the most valuable and answer them. But with that said, if you have a question, there's my email. You can always email me, any question that you have, and I'll do my best to answer it in as timely a manner as possible. At the same time, Mindful Geriatrics, there's a website that I have, so you can go there just to see about me if you'd like more information. Okay, so with that said, let's jump right in and talk about mitigating COVID-19 complications in an outpatient setting. All right, I've got no disclosures. Okay, so we can move through that, but needless to say, here's the objectives. Now, to be exact, guys, when the pandemic first began, no specific treatment, right, for COVID existed, none. I mean, and until recently, this also held true, right? I mean, to tell a patient, well, you're not sick enough to be admitted to the hospital, but, good luck with that COVID thing, and come back if you get sicker, I mean, just leaves any medical provider with this empty feeling in their belly, But since this time, the FDA has granted Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, okay, to several monoclonal antibody therapies as an option to both treat those with COVID-19 and to also prophylax those who have been exposed to COVID-19 and have risk factors that increase their chances of either hospitalization, okay, or decline due to illness. Now, literally, guys, for the first 8 months of the pandemic, clinicians were at a loss other than the wait and see approach. So the ideal scenario, of course, would be, hey, let's prevent severe symptoms in the first place. So with monoclonal antibody therapy, providers now have a way to mitigate severe symptoms from developing those who are at high risk, okay? So with that said, here's the objectives. We're going to discuss in very simple words. I'm going to use very simple terms to describe what monoclonal antibodies are, okay? And what makes them so special. I'll also touch on the role that they're going to have in this pandemic. I think it's also important to understand who's eligible and who's ineligible for the administration of monoclonal antibodies. And finally, it's important to understand how early treatment can lead to improved efficacy outcomes, especially when it comes to treating or preventing progression of COVID-19 symptoms. And so I'll spend a little bit of time on that as well. All right, but here's our objectives. Let me just do one thing here. All right, take me just a second. Thank you for your patience. Just set my timer. Okay, now on that note, on that front, rather, here's the spectrum of illness, okay? And that's, this is the spectrum of illness along the current antiviral therapies and immunomodular therapies. I mean, the focus today, okay, is really going to be on this orange and blue marker that you see there, okay? It's primarily going to be on mild, symptomatic, and asymptomatic disease, and particularly for patients who are at high risk. Okay, this focus is really meant to show you all today how we really can prevent progression of the disease, how we can prevent hospitalization, as well as maximize recovery. But I have to share this with you to some extent. I'm going to show you how this intervention may also affect something we call long COVID, which I hope many of you know has been reported more and more frequently given the new variants in disease that we're seeing. And, you know, in the initial COVID, it wasn't as problematic. Now, with some of these variants, it's much more problematic and much, much more common. So to elaborate, additionally, and for practical purposes, we'll be focusing on neutralizing monoclonal antibodies, okay? And all of these were originally isolated from B cells of recovered patients. Okay, sotrovimab is the only one that was isolated from a SARS-1 patient, while the other two were isolated from SARS-CoV-2. Okay, but what will come from the use of either a single monoclonal antibody or the combination treatment cocktails that bind to several areas on the COVID virus, both really are meant to increase treatment of efficacy, right? And if they're administered in a timely fashion, then the hope is, this is our hope, is that it will prevent escape mutations, okay? The mutations that we're seeing, all right, even in the presence of vaccination, when people get vaccinated and they get reinfected, and then they spread the virus, is an escape mutation. So in itself, then what we're looking at is hopefully the ability to minimize variants of the virus itself by giving monoclonal antibodies, okay? But that's where our focus is going to be today, right here. Okay, and there's the products, Regeneron, we've got Lilly, and then we've got GSK, just for your basic knowledge. And I'll probably refer to them that way because pronouncing the words is embarrassing for me, all right? It's an embarrassment to me. So what is a monoclonal antibody, all right? I mean, these are antibodies, right? These are antibodies like your own body would naturally make. But given the vast nature of people, okay, that we have with us today, let's be simple. All right, let's make it so simple. This definition is simple, and it's just like you see on the slide, exactly that, simple. Monoclonal antibodies are just like the antibodies you make in your own body to fight off infection, okay? And remember, foreign organisms are always trying to get into your body. But these antibodies differ in that they're made in a lab by pharmaceutical companies, okay? And then they're put in your body to help stave off infection, to help fight off infection. Now, what I think is important to know, okay, and important to relay, and to help alleviate concerns, okay, that some people may have, understanding that this is made in a lab, is that this technology isn't new. I mean, the first monoclonal antibody that was approved by the FDA was done in 1986, and it was for kidney transplant rejection. Okay, and then what you see on a slide like this is that there's several therapeutic mAbs, monoclonal antibodies, okay, that have been approved by the US FDA since that time, including ones that are more common in geriatrics, like denosumab, or what goes by the trade name in this country is Prolia. Most of us know it as a drug for osteoporosis, but it's easy to see how this therapy isn't unusual, how it's just in time, it's been approved more and more. But what's amazing? To watch this in action, okay, against an awful disease like COVID, I mean, it's just awesome. It really is. And this is going to make a difference in outcomes, at least initially, all right, unless this virus mutates to a point where these stop working. But needless to say, that's the information that we have before us, okay? So what monoclonal antibodies are designed to do specifically, guys, is to target coronavirus spike proteins. I mean, by targeting the spike protein of COVID-19, monoclonal antibodies interfere with the virus's ability to enter into a human cell. So there you see a very happy human cell, these monoclonal antibodies that are attached to a COVID virus, and COVID cannot enter into the cell. So effectively, all right, what they do is they give the immune system, okay, this leg up so it can mount until it can mount its own response and destroy these foreign organisms inside of your body, but not inside of your cell. That's the key, okay? So that's essentially how they work. Now, and probably most importantly for me, okay, in doing so, when you do that, it makes it very difficult for the SARS-CoV-2 organism, that virus, and that's the virus that causes COVID, to replicate, right? Because if it gets into the human cell, then it has this ability to replicate, all right? That has huge implications regarding things like mutation. I mean, to coin a phrase, a virus can't replicate, okay? A virus that can't replicate can't mutate, right? I mean, part of the reason we're seeing vaccine efficacy decrease is because the COVID-19 is mutating, right? COVID's mutating. And so that has strong implications in terms of what we're going to be able to prevent in the future, all right? Now, as well, although monoclonal antibodies boost the immune system if you're exposed or even if infected by COVID-19, a vaccine does this much easier and it does it much better, all right? So this really should not be thought as some sort of replacement for vaccination, okay? And I'm going to elaborate that on the next slide. But again, it's not a replacement for vaccination, okay? So while you think of monoclonal antibodies as like this guided missile, right? This target that neutralizes the current COVID-19 virus, in actuality, what we know is that they're probably only effective in the body for about 1 month. Again, we're using them to help prophylax, to prevent progression of disease. We're using them when people are sick with COVID, okay, with certain parameters to prevent progression of their disease. And there's probably some data that I've at least read to suggest that it may even work longer than a month, but at least for 1 month, you get this added immunity in your system, okay? What it means to me is this. Should variants then arise, okay, and they will arise, okay, monoclonal antibodies may lose their efficacy in time. So as such, to be a proponent of the vaccine still offers significantly more protection against COVID-19, especially when the whole population gets vaccinated. But at the very least, monoclonal antibodies have now become this tool, right, in the shed against this very wicked disease, okay? Currently, the most prevalent COVID-19 variant, well, currently it depends on where you live, right? So, and it really can literally depend on, what time period you're talking about. You're asking, simply because variants, the virus will change. The virus is constantly evolving, okay? For example, in the United States, the Alpha variant, okay, was the most common, early on in the pandemic, and has since been overthrown by this Delta variant, which is the predominant variant in the United States. Now, the Mu variant, for example, seems to be more predominant in South America, okay, especially in in Northern South America. But to be clear in the form of a definition, okay, because this is designated by the World Health Organization, right? Before you see a list of variants circling the globe, and there's really 4 designations that WHO uses, CDC as well, to evaluate them, right? The list is not static by any means of the stretch, okay? What you see under the variants being monitored, well, many of those variants were in a classification or a variant of interest at one time, okay? But again, to be clear in the form of a definition, the variants designated as variants being monitored, they include variants, okay, for which there has been a clear impact on medical countermeasures, okay? And they've been associated perhaps with either more disease or increased transmission, et cetera, but they are also circulating at very low levels in and around corresponding countries, all right? So they really, for the most part, they don't pose a significant or imminent risk to public health, but they could, and that's the point. And as I alluded to, right, a variant of interest or a variant of concern could be downgraded on this list when there's been significant or sustained reductions in its national or its regional propagation or proportion, okay, over time. But at the same time, they can be upgraded. So needless to say, the variants continue to be closely monitored. And if the data indicates that a variant being monitored warrants more concern, the classification will be changed based on that risk to the population. All right. Well, that's what Delta is, right? The Delta variant has achieved this concern because it appears to be more infectious. And it's may causing more severe disease compared at least to the other circulating variants that were out there. So this brings me to a variant of high consequence, because what that is that causes even more severe disease and greater numbers of hospitalizations. The biggest issue with a variant of this nature is that it's been shown to defeat medical countermeasures, right? Such as vaccines and antiviral drugs and, well, yeah, even monoclonal antibodies. I mean, so far, none of those variants have met that definition. But you guys take a brief moment and just reflect on what that means. Reflect on what would happen if a variant developed into something much more formidable. The Delta variant currently affects about 99% of people who have contracted COVID in the United States, okay? And so this variant of concern, imagine what would happen, all right? So as you can see from this slide, okay, what's the blue circle? The blue circle represents the original COVID virus. It's much, much less contagious than the current variant, noted by the red circle, Delta. Delta's about 2.5 times more infectious, okay? And even more concerning, the variant is now infecting people who had previously been vaccinated, okay? Now, the good news is, right now, no variant has proven to be vaccine resistant, but the Delta variant is spreading faster than the Alpha variant ever did, okay? It's an imperative, it really is, that anyone who hasn't been vaccinated reconsider that, and maybe even do so. Otherwise, as you probably noted, the WHO, World Health Organization, they've started naming the variants, right, by way of the Greek alphabet. We're going to get to Zata, right, in no time if we keep up at the current pace we're keeping up. Okay. So there are other challenges that we as clinicians have tried to overcome. I mean, a lot of experts will suggest that maybe 3% of the US population may not respond fully to a COVID-19 vaccine, because of either some sort of immunocompromising reason or maybe some immunosuppressive medication that they're taking. But there's also additional current and ongoing challenges that we really need to think of. I mean, let's look at each of these individually if we can, okay? First and foremost, in some communities, I mean, there's just low vaccination uptake, okay? I mean, that's shown in this graph right here. And not surprisingly, the rates of COVID, okay, in places where the vaccine uptake has been low, well, it also causes more disease, right? I mean, we've seen more disease in those states. But, I don't, when somebody says I've been vaccinated, I don't look down on them. It behooves me to talk to them and deal with it, right? I mean, people have reservations about something that's new. That's not unrealistic, right? I mean, it's our duty. It's our duty as providers. It's our duty as care providers to explain this and to help people understand the safety and efficacy profiles despite the fast tracking of something like a vaccine, okay? So it's our duty to do that, and that's what we do, all right? As I stated earlier, nearly all the COVID cases now in the United States are due to the Delta variant. It's significantly more contagious And as I'd shown you in that previous slide, but it's still a little too early to know if it's more deadly. All right, though the signals really don't point to that. Okay, but keep in mind, the more people that this guy infects, all right, the more likely we are going to move to a variant that is more deadly. So that's another challenge. Okay, and probably the most concerning issue for me as a clinician is the amount of breakthrough I'm seeing. I mean, I've seen tons of breakthrough now. People who have been vaccinated are getting reinfected. I want you to know something. That's literally the impetus for this lecture. I'm worried. I'm really worried. Ladies and gentlemen, the infected have shifted. They're not just infecting the old anymore. They're affecting the young now. And while vaccine breakthrough cases are expected because no vaccine is 100% effective at preventing illness, this situation is only going to get worse if variants occur. You know, we do know that the risk of things like hospitalization, right, infection, death, they're all much lower in vaccinated people compared to the unvaccinated. But what is the rate of getting COVID after vaccination? You know, for purposes of clarity, a breakthrough infection, this is the definition, is defined as the detection of SARS, right? SARS-CoV-2 in a respiratory specimen, okay, collected from a person that's been greater than 14 days after they've either completed the recommended doses of the COVID vaccine, okay, or they've been infected, all right, natural infection. But the problem is that not every state reports this consistently, right? Okay, so as of August 30th, at least from what I was able to gather, there's only 35 states in the District of Columbia, okay, who publicly reported breakthrough cases in any way, shape, or form. Alabama, for example, they reported about a 10.2% breakthrough rate. New Jersey reported as high as an 18% breakthrough rate. All right, and so while the consistency among states may falter, there is one thing that is very clear here. All right, we are seeing more breakthrough in the vaccinated. That's the point. The point is we're seeing more and more and more. So consequently, and I mentioned this before, there's an incredible shift, guys, amongst those who are getting infected. And here's an example of what that shift looks like. Okay, take last winter, for example. For patients ranging between 21 and 30 years old, okay, there was only one death in every 625 patients. Now it's one death in every 51 patients. That's 12 times higher than it was previously. And when you compare that to 80-year-olds, okay, and older, which I think everybody here knows, I mean, what a population that suffered incredibly. I mean, at the height of the pandemic, I mean, it was just disparaging to see. You know, as a person who predominantly treats older people, it was awful to see. That death rate now has declined dramatically. I mean, from more than 1 in 3 to now 1 in 6. But in part, that's due to a couple of things. One is the high vaccination rates amongst the elderly and the boosters they're going to get. It should help keep those numbers way down. But since I've seen 60 or so cases of breakthrough now in the elderly, we need to pull out all the stops to prevent this virus from mutating into something more deadly. Okay? And just to give you perspective, due to the lower vaccination rates and I'm a geriatrician, right? I mean, 60 is old in my world. And actually it's old because I'm approaching that age now. And so, you know, the older I get, the more absurd numbers that define elderly are. But needless to say, I mean, I would consider 60 a young person, okay? But this shift has resulted in the most widely affected population being between the ages of 21 and 60, okay? Well, then, you know, what happens as these people get vaccinated or infected? I mean, you're going to see a shift to people who are even younger, guys. So as these people get infected or as these people get vaccinated, the shift is going to go to younger people. A virus can only go where it has a host. And I think most of us know where that host is. It's kids. Okay? So with that said, and that, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, that's why I'm here to explain this novel treatment, right? I mean, a big push for this came from an article that was published by JAMA. It was in June of 2020, and this really set the way for the potential use of monoclonal antibodies in SARS-CoV-2. Now, studies were already in part being developed and using monoclonal antibodies for both prevention and treatment. So I don't want to make the case bigger than it really is, but I'll tell you what, this became an impetus for a lot more happenings, right? I mean, these at the time of this publication, most of this had been demonstrated in either animal models for SARS-CoV-1 or MERS. Remember MERS? Okay, for those monoclonal antibodies. So it was only a logical next step that they would pull something out of the hat for COVID. But I'm here to make the case for monoclonals. So here's that study that pushed things the next direction, okay? And here's that direction. I mean, what followed was a phase 2 trial that was done by Lilly in October and published in New England Journal. Okay, the primary outcome for that study, though, was viral load, all right? And boy, in 11 days, guys, people who received monoclonal antibodies, they cleared the virus entirely. Okay, but what they did then is they did further evaluation on the data and looked at hospitalizations and extrapolated that. I mean, that revealed, listen to this, that revealed a reduction in hospitalizations by approximately 4 times that of a patient who did not receive monoclonal antibodies. But the only problem with the study is that it was really small. I mean, really small, okay? And that makes sense, it's a phase 2 trial. But prior to this, I want you to consider one important detail. We had nothing. We had absolutely nothing in the way of treatment. In a setting such as an outpatient setting where I see patients specifically, we just simply said, well, good luck with that COVID thing. We hope not to see you back. But if you come back, if you get sick, come back, right? If you get sicker. As a clinician, that was awful to say to these high-risk patients. You can't imagine the fear on their faces when you would send them away. Right? I mean, this study right here led to emergency use authorization for bamlanivimab, okay, or what I call BAM. It's easier to say BAM, for high-risk patients in the outpatient setting, right? I mean, the problem is, in early on in the course of the disease, the virus was able to elude bamlanivimab, or BAM, right? That virus was able to elude BAM. Okay, it only recently came back as an option as a monoclonal to treat because now it's in a combination. So it's only been recently because of that cocktail that Lilly produced that we're able to consider the use of that product now for treatment. Okay. Well, by January 2021, Regeneron had released something from a phase 2/3 trial, okay, showing another significant reduction in patients with one or more COVID risk factors or COVID related healthcare risk factors, as they call it. But that also allowed for emergency use authorization of their product. And what that did, guys, is that just catapulted researchers into a multitude of additional trials. Okay, and I'm not going to bore you with all those trials, okay, one after the other. All right, but it demonstrated, every single one after another just demonstrated efficacy for viral load reduction, for reduction in the risk of being hospitalized, and wow, the important one, death. Okay, I mean, that's what basically the studies were able to do. All right, so here's a compilation of some of that data for review. But by mid to late 2021, evidence was pretty clear that this was an option for treatment, especially for patients with mild to moderate symptoms. And it's not been now shown to just mitigate the progression of COVID, but importantly, mitigate the symptoms that people get, right? I mean, so this red circle right here that you see, okay, this plays a role. The time to symptom resolution showed a 4-day reduction compared to those who had never received monoclonals, okay? And I mean, one of the biggest reasons that this becomes important, that single information is so important, is because long haul COVID now affects more than 80% of every person infected. 80% of every person who gets COVID now has these long haul symptoms. All right. So many individuals who had COVID early on in the course of disease, their symptoms persisted, and obviously it caused a decline in their quality of life. But initially, when people looked at that, okay, this came from a study from JAMA, it suggested that maybe 30% of individuals still had symptoms between 30 and 110 days. Well, in this cohort of individuals with COVID-19 that were followed up as long as 9 months, all right, after their illness, 1/3 of them still had persistent symptoms. Well, that data is now shifting. And long-term effects of COVID now make up 80% of every people who get the illness. For me, what's so striking about that, about these long haulers, guys, I would understand it, right? If you were in an ICU, if you had been hospitalized and then were there for days on end. But that's not who the long haulers are comprising. These are individuals who experience mild to moderate cases of COVID. And more importantly, the majority were not hospitalized. You've got to go look at this study. It's incredible. So like any clinician, okay, I've started to think a lot differently about what getting infected means. This is one of the reasons why the preceding study with REGEN-COV was so important that I pointed out, okay? It's not just affecting viral load, people. It's preventing hospitalization, but it's minimizing symptom sequelae, all right? It's associated with this wicked disease. So with that said, it shouldn't surprise you that anyone in government would have approved this, okay? Albeit it's in the form of an emergency use authorization and treatment in the form of post-exposure prophylaxis. I mean, why is that? It's because these long haulers, they're going to be using our medical health dollars, okay, in time. So as it stands now, and honestly, I don't even want to try and pronounce these words, okay, of the medications. It's just going to embarrass me. All right. This is what the treatment platform looks like at this point. Okay. So for example, BAM-EDI, all right, that's the first one on the list there. It's available for both treatment and post-exposure prophylaxis, and it comes in an IV, all right. The CASI-MD, that's how I call it, okay, is available for both treatment and post-exposure prophylaxis. But it's not just in an IV form. It can also be administered subcutaneously. I mean, for patients that I serve, guys, for the patient population that I see, long-term care, assisted living, independent living, I mean, my God, that's a huge leg up, right? And finally, there's sotrovimab, and that's the one I can't pronounce. That's the GSK drug, right? I mean, the first one was made by Lilly, guys. The second one's made by REGEN-COV, okay? And the final one is made by, the second one's made by Regeneron, excuse me. And the third one is made by GSK. But it's the easiest of the three to say, right? Sotrovimab. I mean, that's the one I can pronounce. But that's available as well, but it's treatments in the form of an IV, okay? So before I move on to the recommended treatment guidelines as developed by the NIH, I got to share with you one additional study, okay? Now, this data was provided to us by JAMA. And since preventative interpretations are needed, okay, preventative interventions are needed to protect people like residents and staff and skilled nursing facilities and assisted living facilities, to just mitigate, to just minimize the damage that this virus can do in those settings. This study looked at patient populations in nursing homes. Okay, it was a randomized, double-blinded, single dose phase 3 trial, and it enrolled residents in exactly 74 nursing homes and assisted livings across the United States. And they had at least one confirmed SARS-CoV-2 case, index case in their buildings. This is a real-world study. Okay, the median age of the patients in these buildings was 75 years of age. That's right up my alley of patients that I care for, okay? The median age of the staff was 43 years. Pretty realistic, right? I mean, this study looks like a very realistic study. Get this, that study demonstrated an 80% reduction in developing symptomatic COVID infection in residents that had received monoclonal antibodies. It had only achieved a 42% reduction in developing symptomatic COVID infection in staff. Now, I'm not going to go into the reasons why staff were so much lower than patients, okay? But if you use your mind just a little bit, I'm sure you can figure out the reason, all right? This real-world study applies to patients that I care for. 80% reduction in developing symptomatic COVID. Incredible. All right. Now, to piggyback on that data And it emphasizes why the NIH probably took, the National Institutes of Health in the United States took this approach. Okay, there are now these recommended treatment guidelines based on criteria from the FDA Emergency Use Authorization, right? Now, it's important to note that the likelihood of developing severe COVID would increase anytime you have a risk factor. If you have multiple high-risk conditions or comorbidities, your rate of death goes up. But that's also a clinical judgment, right? I mean, providers get to make some of those clinical judgments. So appropriately, I have to mention this. The current EUAs, albeit they have a designation for a risk population, they state this. They state that the use of anti-SARS-CoV-2 monoclonal antibodies could be considered for many patients outside of this category. So the biggest point I want to make about this slide is this. Since the data with monoclonals is strong, okay, the guidelines are now recommending this treatment as a Class A for high-risk patients in an outpatient setting. You guys, the only other treatment in COVID-19 that achieves that level of treatment currently, okay, it's on an inpatient basis, and it's dexamethasone. That's it. So monoclonals definitely have a place, okay? Now, with that said, I have to be, I hope what I've done is I've convinced a lot of you, right, of the importance of vaccination and maybe the importance of monoclonal antibodies. But let's just discuss now how a clinician or any other person would go about ordering this, okay, in a minute, and getting these things administered into people's bodies, all right? I also want to make this important point. As of right now, the use of monoclonal antibodies is only in an outpatient setting. It's not inpatient. So it's not recommended for hospital patients currently. There are some signals out there that suggest that it may benefit people who haven't developed antibodies in the past, but you know, that it's not there yet. Okay, so we need to wait until some of that data comes in. Needless to say, and unfortunately, every state's different in the United States and how they can procure monoclonal antibodies. And on that note, every country too has developed their own process. But initially, pharmacies were able to buy it. I mean, they were able to just order monoclonal antibodies directly from the supplier that was designated by the federal government. Shortly after, when the feds became inundated, the response was, we'll shift it all to the departments of health around the entire nation. Okay, and so each department of health now controls the allocation of their medication. So what essentially happens is HHS publishes this allocation numbers for each state. Then the Department of Health anticipates the supply and figures out where that supply goes. Excuse me. But as these supplies, guys, become more depleted, and our practice, okay, Twin Cities physicians, our practice has personally seen this. We're going to find ourselves more and more having difficulty getting the supply. In other words, I say this in as delicate a way as possible, okay? Pharmacies have to do their work with the Department of Health. They've got to be able to work well with the Department of Health to continue to receive MAP, all right? And that's just in order to ensure an adequate supply. But providers need to do their part as well, okay? Part of the reason the supply is low in some of the pharmacies is because providers aren't requesting them. It's a supply-demand issue. That's what it is. If there's demand, there's going to be supply, all right? But I also need to make this pitch, okay, as medicines become allocated. I believe personally that the Department of Health needs to consider the need of patients that live in congregate living, okay? Now, later, I'm going to show you a video of a very frail elderly person who I gave monoclonal antibody to. I'm grateful. I'm really grateful to her because she was willing to contribute to my education and yours, okay? Very willingly to do that. But you're going to see from the video, she's frail appearing. I mean, can you imagine, guys, coordinating the transport of all of these frail adults to an infusion center? I mean, it was a weekend when I gave the person you're going to see on the video, when I administered her medication, okay? And I hope who is listening to this lecture in particular, okay, are local departments of health. Hang on, guys, just maybe make sure. Okay, as a geriatrician, I mean, I treat some facilities. I treat people who are frail, and they're found in ALs, and they're found in long-term care centers. And, you know, any transport to an infusion center would create an incredible challenge for many of these patients. And recognize this, many of those patients, guys, they usually require hands-on care by another staff member. To be simple, the value of these medications needs to be not just focused on infusion centers. It needs to be focused outside of that as well. All right, so that's my pitch. I hope somebody from the Department of Health out there is listening. All right. But there is a checklist for administration. I mean, and I'm going to do my best to cover these individually. Okay. But once a provider determines that somebody is eligible, okay, then he or she should discuss treatment with the patient and the additional care team. And that can include also the facility and the family, right? I mean, the treatment location for administration should be identified as early as possible. And since I'm a geriatrician and I treat people in community dwellings, I mean, I'm going to put a lot of focus on the sub-Q administration. That alternative is a very good alternative over infusion. Okay. There's also a need for post-MAB monitoring, right? I mean, that will take up to an hour. And importantly, you need a document as well. Okay. So to determine eligibility, this is what has to happen. First and foremost, you must have exposure or be positive for COVID-19. And you must not be hospitalized. And you must not have new or worsening oxygen requirements due to COVID-19. And you must be over the age of 12 years, okay, 12 years of age, and weigh at least 40 kilos or 88 pounds. And be at risk for complications due to severe COVID. And probably it should be administered within 10 days of symptoms. Ideally, in my mind, based on data, 4 days is preferred. Okay. So, and this is an algorithm that I developed for eligibility. I mean, use it for whatever purpose you want. Okay. My recommendation is if you work in a clinic, if you work in long-term care, if you work in assisted living, you print this and post it. Okay. Post it. That way you're building your staff in that building mostly. They're going to see it. They're going to be a proactive resource for you to getting these drugs in people. And honestly, when sifting through all of the studies that I looked at, okay, I was so surprised. You guys, there's no algorithms out there to help a provider flow through the process. You know, and I know that, and though I think that people are very capable of doing this on their own accord, algorithms are helpful, especially when it comes to advocacy for medications, okay? And just helping a person sift through what may or may not occur, all right? After you've determined the patient is eligible, though, at high risk, and there's the definitions of what that treatment eligibility is, okay? This can be found, I didn't put the resource there, but there's a resource earlier in the different slides of what high risk actually means, okay? But I want to make an important point about this. Other medical conditions and factors can also place patients at a high risk for progression to severe COVID. It doesn't just need to be these things, okay? Ethnicity, for example, race, for example, those are both important indicators of risk. So this authorization isn't simply limited to a medical condition or a factor listed here, okay? If the clinician sees fit and he or she can justify the use of the medication, give it, you know? Now I say this because I've had people that are very old live through COVID, and I've had people that are very young die with it. I mean, sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to why that occurs. Okay, it's just chance on occasion. Okay, so if it's determined that these medications are going to be used for post exposure prophylaxis, then these are some standard definitions that are typically followed. I mean, MAB can be given independent of vaccination status. All right. But as was discussed earlier with breakthrough, for example, and alluding to the importance of documentation, individuals are considered fully vaccinated 2 weeks after their second dose of a 2-dose series or 2 weeks after the single-dose vaccine, okay? And there's other criteria as well. But if the provider believes the patient isn't expected to build enough of an immune response, for example, someone with an immunocompromised condition or somebody who's taking immunosuppressive meds, then they would also qualify based off of this, okay? Another consideration is what the definition of close contact means. If somebody was infected with SARS-CoV-2 within 6 feet of the infected at a total of 15 minutes, okay, or more, or they're providing care at home to someone who was sick, all right? They have direct physical contact with that person, or they're being exposed to respiratory droplets from an infected person, then they're also considered high risk. Now, for additional details, go to the website listed there that I have on the page there, okay, to get more information about the definition of what post-exposure prophylaxis means. But I want everybody to notice something, okay? This definition is very fluid. Shortly, because of supply issues, I'm going to discuss some triage decisions that some of us are going to have to make. And, you know, I've had to make them. I mean, it's not a fun decision to make. You're going to have to put triage into place at times recognizing that some people really deserve the medication sooner than others based on risk, okay? But just realize that statement opens up the floodgates about who can receive therapy, okay? Additionally, providers will want to discuss with patients using simple language of what monoclonal antibodies are, right? And then this is the verbiage that I've come up with right here on this slide. Okay, but and feel free to change it however you want, make it a way that's very suitable for you. Okay, but you know, what I'll say is something like this. This is an antibody treatment similar to your own antibody. Okay, and since your body can be a little bit slow, okay, to sometimes stave off disease or make the right type of antibodies, or if you have a weakened immune system, we're going to give you a lab-based antibody to kickstart your natural immunity. Okay, and it's going to be helpful, I hope, in fighting off infections. But the benefit is you're able to fight off infection faster, and you're less likely to get sicker or end up hospitalized. Now, there's two ways to get the product. One is through an IV. The other is subcutaneously under your skin. Since this is being used, though, under Emergency Use Authorization, you should know that this treatment has not yet been approved by the FDA, though there are several studies to indicate that it's both safe and extremely effective. And side effects, you know, they're uncommon, but they do occur. They occur in fewer than 1 in every 100 patients who get the treatment. Most common side effects include pain at the injection site if you use the sub-Q form, dizziness, nausea, headache, rash, even more rare things like fevers, chills, shortness of breath, wheezing, low blood pressure, you know, muscle aches, hives, itching. But I'm going to be here. I'm going to observe you for an hour during the administration to make sure you tolerate it well. Do you have any questions? I mean, that's the basic thing that I would do, right? And then you identify treatment location, because that comes next. Now, like I said before, I believe the Department of Health around the nations, I believe all the departments of health need to consider what it means to give somebody out of their homes and into an infusion center, okay? Consider giving providers that access to the products, and I can assure you it's going to make a difference in outcomes of care, all right? And so don't forget, all patients in these settings require additional hands-on care by another staff member, okay? And this is a website for infusion centers located around the country, okay? So for those of you who are in need of finding an infusion center, this site is awesome, guys. You just plug in the zip code and bam, out comes the infusion center across the United States. It's pretty impressive. And now administration. I mean, to administer monoclonal antibodies, you need to, first of all, retrieve it, right? But it should be refrigerated, okay? Kept at about 2 to 8 degrees Celsius or 35 to 40 degrees to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Leave it out for about 20 minutes. Don't agitate it, okay, prior to administration. You must use the product within 4 hours of taking it out of the fridge. And if it's given via an infusion, you'll need an infusion set, of course, right? And you'll need about 50 to 250 milliliters of fluid, 0.9% NS, all right? Lower volumes for patients at risk of CHF, please. And administer that IV infusion over about 20 to 30 minutes. If you're giving it subcutaneously, you're going to require 4 3 or 5 mil Luer-Lock syringes. Always bring a 19 to 21 gauge syringe. The first time I ever gave it, man, it was terrible. I was trying to pull it out of a 25 gauge syringe. It was terrible. All right, so I actually had to leave the room. I had to degown, leave the room, come back in, regown, and get a 19 to 21 gauge needle. You pull it up, and then you give it with a 25 to 27, preferably a 1-inch needle for injection in a sub-Q region of the body. And remember that sub-Q injections require 4 separate injection sites, right? And also there's no need to adjust for renal impairment, which that makes it easy. There's some additional supplies that you may want to consider, especially if you're administering the product, EpiPen, Benadryl, right? Ensure they're in the facility, gloves, alcohol wipes, Band-Aids, so on and so forth. So, but let me show you a video example, okay?
Thank you for agreeing to be recorded, okay, for the learning of other people. All right. My name's Steven Atkinson. I'm a physician assistant. I work for a company, okay, that comes into the building and services adults your age. And I understand your husband unintentionally got ill with COVID and brought it here to you. I'm sorry. I understand your symptoms that you're reporting to me. Most of it includes no shortness of breath, right?
Mm.
Okay, and no fever or chills, okay, and no cough.
Okay. But every once in a while I have chills.
You have chills,
Yeah.
okay. Do you have chills to the point where it's causing you to shake and you can't
No.
control it?
No.
Okay, and you're not having any chest pain, any nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea? Okay, and let's see your oxygenation. Okay, let's just put this on this finger here. We'll see what the reading is. Your hands are kind of cold, so it's going to take just a second. Good, it's 97%, okay? And we'll continue to check this over the period of time that I'll be here with you today. All right, so there's an experimental drug. It's called RegenCode. There's been a lot of studies since the beginning of COVID about the efficacy of it. And the studies have clearly shown that people who take it have a decreased risk of getting hospitalized. I know that that was discussed with you, okay? The biggest side effects include gastrointestinal side effects like nausea, sometimes vomiting, but it's rare. And actually, in the actual group that got the monoclonal antibody, okay, they actually did better than the group that got the sugar water, okay? So because it's experimental, though, I want to make sure that you're comfortable getting the medication. It was approved for emergency use authorization. There's no cost to you at all. It's 4 injections. They go in your belly, in the fat of your belly, okay? And albeit it can be a little bit comfortable going in your belly, it tends to reside just shortly after the injection. And I'll be here with you. I'm going to stay with you for about an hour, okay? Just to make sure you don't have any side effects. And if you do, we'll take the appropriate action, okay? Understanding that, all right, monoclonal antibodies are designed to boost your immune system, okay, during this period of time that you had exposure. And I understand your exposure was just shortly, was within the last 4 or 5 days, right? Okay, so with that known, are you okay getting the medicine? You feel okay, me giving you the medication? Okay, we'll do that, all right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna expose your belly. I've already drawn up the medication, okay? And so the medication is already drawn up. I'm not gonna put it at your waistline, and I'm not gonna get near your belly button, okay? I'm gonna come in 4 different quadrants over here, okay? All right. So here's the medication. Yeah. We'll start by getting one right here, okay? I'm not going to go all the way in with this needle, just a little bit. We'll feel the pressure of it in your belly. I use a 25 gauge needle. You can use one that's smaller. I do recommend that people who get this, when they're drawing this medication up, sting a little bit. It stings, doesn't it? Okay? Okay. So I do recommend that people who get it, I'm going to put the other one right above.
Okay, guys, and so that's basically the gist of it. Now, you know, I mean, she received all 4 infections. I think what was impressive about that patient is after she got it, she felt like within 30 minutes, she felt better. Now that's anecdotal, right? That's simply anecdotal, but needless to say, it was great to see a patient respond that way. And I've done this a number of times now. So I've seen varying responses. I've not seen any real significant side effects other than injection site pain. That's it. And so everybody's thankfully, all right, they've tolerated it very well. So one thing is this though, for post-infusion or injection and monitoring, all providers must commit to monitoring for at least 60 minutes. Okay, now as more MABs are given, guys, I expect that number to decrease to about 30. And to date, again, like I mentioned, I haven't seen any really significant reactions to people who have gotten it. Patients should still continue to isolate after they've received it. In my state, a minimum of 10 days is still the standard even if you receive MABs, okay? And since the patient can have a reaction up to 24 hours later, I would do your best to continue to monitor vital signs. That can't always be done. I can't do that in some of the independent settings, but you can bet that I get on the phone and call those patients to make sure they tolerated it well. And then there's documentation. And this is something I've come up with. Again, feel free to alter this any way you want. I mean, this is what I said at today's visit. The patient and I discussed monoclonal antibodies as treatment for their COVID-19 infection or exposure to COVID-19 that puts them at risk for worsening outcomes. Okay, patient or family, if the patient has an advocate, guys, understands this product is under emergency use authorization, which implies the FDA has not approved the drug. Patient was exposed within blank hours of their current infection. But at this time, I would advise administration for anything other than about 10 days. Okay, as I had mentioned earlier, guys. The current oxygen saturation is, and then you fill that number in, the risk factors that I feel justify this include, I put that in my note. I know some providers don't put it, and that's fine. It's just difference in providers. And then the patient received, and then you put the drug. Now for REGEN-COV, remember you have to administer at least 2.5 mils of the product, and you have to choose at least 2 sites, the back of each other upper arm, 2 to 4 independent sites. You notice I did, in her case, I did the belly. All 4 were in the belly, okay? Or each anterior thigh would be 2 sites. So, you know, some people have chose thighs and the backs of each arm. And then the patient was observed for side effects for 1 hour post-administration. And then I do vitals at 15, 30, 45, and 60, or for any change in condition. The patient was made aware that the future COVID vaccination, this is important, okay? No future COVID vaccination any future COVID-19 vaccination should now be delayed for 90 days after monoclonal antibodies are given, including boosters, okay, that may be offered. Okay, now the patient can receive other vaccines, those like influenza or pneumococcal vaccine, but not the COVID vaccine. And the patient was also told if outbreaks continue to occur in the building, that additional monoclonal antibodies can be given. Once a month, you can go back and you can give another dose if there's continues to be outbreaks in buildings that you're in, okay? The next step, though, is making these hard decisions. And this is something that was reported by the NIH. This is on the NIH's website. Due to shortages, guys, and logistic constraints, it's important to recognize at times triaging is going to have to occur to determine who gets these drugs, okay? The purpose of this statement was only to provide guidance for individuals that might receive the greatest benefit from MAB therapy. And obviously, it only needs to be done when it becomes necessary to triage due to supply and demand. Given my current experience with giving monoclonals, guys, unfortunately, I've had to make some of these decisions in terms of looking at people who really should get them. It's unfortunate that that's what's happened. And it's not an easy decision, but it's an important decision, right? So the NIH's decision tree for prioritizing when it comes to the treatment can be found at the website there. But they recommended treatment, of course, patients with COVID. Okay, so if a patient has COVID and is at risk for decline, they recommended these people get it over post-exposure prophylaxis. Okay, they also recommended prioritizing MABs for unvaccinated or incompletely vaccinated people, as well as vaccinated individuals who were likely not going to mount a good response, maybe due to their own individual constraints, like they're immunocompromised, or they're taking immunosuppressive medications, or if they're aged. Okay, that's another one that fell into the list. It's not as big of a list as you can see that. It's not a huge list, right? But it can have very discernible sentiments, guys, when it needs to be employed. At least that's been my experience. Okay, but here's the bottom line. Okay, the bottom line is this here. If a patient, for the most part, meets criteria, consider administration. And to recap, confirmed COVID infection or exposure, mild to moderate COVID symptoms of a patient who's not hospitalized and not requiring new oxygen therapy or having an increase in their baseline oxygen needs. Okay, symptom onset less than 10 days, again, ideally within 4, and at risk for progression to disease. Okay, so in short, from the data that we've gathered here today, okay, and from the information we've discussed, and I want to thank the University of Colorado and basically Geriatric Grand Rounds for supplying this information right here. Okay, it's pretty clear that the studies have showed that monoclonal antibodies reduce the risk of hospitalization and deaths by about 70% when you look at the data. They decrease symptoms by about 4 days, which can have future implications on things like long COVID. Okay, they've been shown to be effective against the Delta variant. Adverse events are very rare, all right? The CASI-MD, that's RegenCov, can be given subcutaneously. It can be given independent of somebody's vaccination status, all right? And it can be also given for post-exposure prophylaxis, all right? Thank you very much, everybody. I greatly appreciate it. Look at that, a little over. Okay, with that said, guys, address all your questions with PESI. They'll send them to me. You can also email me personally. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And I appreciate your time today. Okay, have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye now.